Grace, mercy, and peace to you from the triune God, source of life, our sustainer, creator, liberator, and lover. Amen. In the Holy Scriptures, right here, there are 2,300 references to money, possessions, and wealth. 2,300 references. Approximately 15% of Jesus' teachings and 11 out of the 39 parables reference money or wealth, or use an object like a coin or a practice of paying your taxes to animate God's kingdom, like what it looks through God's eyes as an economy of grace, where there is enough food, there is enough justice, there is enough compassion for everyone. I need to tell you, though, none of the references, not a single one of the 2,300 references, offer a quick get-rich formula for financial security. At the first service, Mary in the front row went, "Dang." Instead, all of these references, they offer comfort or they offer challenge. Comfort or challenge. For those who are destitute and crushed by life, there is an overwhelming theme of comfort, of a relaying of God's abundance and God's provision, that those who are feeling deeply poor or in need are not alone. Like from Isaiah 55, we hear these words, "Hear, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price." And for those who have great wealth, who uphold laws and practices that exploit the poor, God offers warning after warning, challenge. As Jesus reminds in Matthew 19, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal." Or from the words of the prophet Amos that Carl read just this morning. He was speaking out against the northern kingdom of Israel, who had institutionalized unethical business practices. He says this, "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and selling the sweepings of the wheat." Oh, money. It complicates so much of our lives. It occupies our worry and sometimes the majority of our efforts. For the last 4 months, Dave and I have been trying to buy a car. This is a ridiculous in this season. Do we buy a new one and wait and wait and wait for it to come into stock because we would like to buy something that is a hybrid, something good for the economy? Or do we buy an overpriced and inflated car that maybe we can afford, we won't need to finance? However, how long will that last? It occupies our mind. Do you know how many times I'm on Craigslist? I'm checking for a deal. I'm looking for someone who just is like needing to get rid of it fast. I will take it for you. But yeah, money, our finances, it consumes us at times as we're trying to navigate the world that we're in. I've been listening lately to a podcast on NPR's Marketplace when I'm out for a walk, and it's called "This is Uncomfortable." I don't know if any of you have listened to it. I highly recommend it. There's 6 seasons of it, a few, maybe 5 to 7 episodes throughout each year. And it talks about how money influences and messes with our life. And the reporter, she does a phenomenal job. Rima is her name, and she's excellent at lifting out stories. They're intimate and personal about being able to afford to have, if you're infertile, to be able to go through all of the IVF to be able to have a child. Or the complications when it comes to our criminal system. And the one that I listened to recently was called Endless Circles of Debt. And in this, she lifts up a voice that I would never have heard if she had not featured this podcast. She interviewed Dalip Singh and his daughter. And in this episode, they tell the story of Dalip, who immigrated to the U.S. in the 90s from India, the early 90s. And he was told that one of the best jobs that he could get right away was to be a taxi driver in New York. And so he was persuaded to do this, and he had to take out a $250,000 loan to get a taxi medallion. I never even heard about a taxi medallion, but to drive taxi, Haley, you're like, yep, you're shaking your head. To drive taxi, you have to have a taxi medallion. This loan had a 12% interest. He made about $30,000 a year, 3 children, his wife was a cashier. As the story unfolds, one of their children gets leukemia and his wife needs to stay home to take care of the children, so he drove more and more hours to make ends meet. In a heartbreaking moment in one of the episodes, his daughter tells a story of on her 16th birthday, she received some money. And she took the money from friends and family and she took it to her dad and said, please use this to pay the bills. And at first he refused and then he relented because he needed to pay the bills, and he cried for 5 minutes in front of her. As the story progresses, and I can't tell all the details, but he has to sell eventually because of Uber and Lyft, and he lost 30 to 40% of his income. He then has to sell his car, and he has to forego his medallion. But now the loan that he bought back in the 90s was $500,000 because of not being able to make enough to pay on this loan. As I listened to this, it was wild to hear that at every possible way he tried to pay off this loan. There was no way that he could ever make enough money, work enough hours to ever get ahead. He was caught in an unrelenting system that exploits and keeps people in debt. And my goodness, there are so many examples of modern day exploitation. High interest payday loans, our justice system that punitively leaves the poor vulnerable and in debt, more in debt than rehabilitating them, regressive tax laws. Oh my goodness, people, we could go deep in the weeds to look and analyze the systemic economic inequality that is all around us, but so often we don't want to see. Because it's easier to just point to the individual, to see economic vulnerability as a moral failing. You've heard people say this: if they would just get a job, if they would just pay their bills on time, if they could just save for retirement. We have all been socialized. Our American culture has told us that everything reduces down to an individual and their own decision. So the man on the corner experiencing homelessness, well, he did this or he did that. Are you with me? Do you see how we do this? It's in casual conversation. The woman at the free grocery store who had to file for bankruptcy, well, she didn't do this. The person who failed to pay their rent, well, they didn't do this. The former taxi driver from New York in massive debt, well, he didn't pay his loans. When we don't see the bigger picture, when we don't see the systems that are at work, we reduce everything down to the individual, and they are further exploited and victimized. And we just see this as normal. It's just a part of living everyday life in our society. Today, I want to look at our parable with a very different lens. Because as I was doing research this week, I realized that there has been a Eurocentric, Euro-American capitalistic lens that has been interpreting this parable of the steward or the manager for years and years and years. Like, even when I said just the title for this parable, it was dishonest steward, crooked steward, shrewd steward. Each one of them had a negative, biased connotation just in the interpretation of this story. And so the parable, if we look at it with the lens of a system, we're going to notice a few things right from the beginning. So pull out your bulletin. This is going to be like one of those, we're going to work it out together. Jesus said to his disciples, there was a wealthy landowner. A wealthy landowner. So right there, we need to stop, because this person owned land. Within the Roman Empire, there was a growing tendency that those who had land would be able to amass more land, and wealth continued to be propped up into a few, and those who were at the bottom remained in the bottom, and often in cycles of dependence upon those who had the wealth. So we have a landowner who probably has quite a bit of land and has been working to build this wealth for a long time. And it has probably been on the backs of others who are impoverished. There is in this, we see, do you notice that there's charges that are brought against this manager? And I would like you to know that we don't know if they're true or not. I read one commentator who said, my goodness gracious, if you were working for a large landowner, there was a lot of jockeying. There was a lot of people trying to get promoted in different ways. Have you ever worked in a job where it was highly competitive? Have you ever worked someplace where you didn't trust some of your other coworkers, that they would speak well of you? What if there were accusations that were brought to him and they were false, but he just knew, hey, I'm not going to have a job anytime soon? And you notice we get a moment where we get to hear his inner dialogue in a different version of it, not the one, we're using the egalitarian version or the inclusive Bible version for this service, but at the earlier service we used the New Revised Standard Version. And in that one it says, he says, I am too weak to dig and too proud to beg. He is too weak to dig and too proud to beg. He knows that in this moment, his future is heading toward poverty. It's happening that soon he is now going to be a part of a class that is going to be in a circle and a cycle of debt. So there is fear and there is anxiety, and he is going to try to preserve himself, but probably his family that he's taking care of. And he is what's known as, in this system, a retainer. Then a retainer was actually at this intersection where here's the landowner, and his job is to help the landowner make as much profit as possible. But yet also he's in relationship with all those who are in debt to the landowners, but he's seeking to be in relationship with them too. Do you see the hard place that he's in? He is working in a system where he is being crunched on both sides. Have you ever worked in a system where you felt squeezed? And trying to make the right decisions, you're having to speak to so many different people. I think of teachers, I think of any of you who are working in business, any of you might even be at Boeing where you're trying to get promotions, but you're being squeezed on so many fronts, and there's decisions that you are having to make, but there's decisions that are sometimes made for you. But here he's being squeezed in the middle. And in this moment, one commentator said, it's death by digging or death by begging. Whatever it is, he is going to be at the mercy of someone else. And so what does he do? He just is like, hey, he starts cutting. It's like a fire sale. I'm just going to make deals with everybody so I can have some friends when I no longer have this job. Now, this is an interesting thing, because how the landowner probably made money is, according to Jewish law, you can't use interest. Like that we commonly know as interest. You can't do that, but you can inflate the prices. So this landowner more than likely would say, oh, you don't owe 2 barrels of oil, you owe 4, you owe 5. Oh, you don't owe 2 containers of wheat, you owe 4 or you owe 5. So there's still a way that their profits would be made. So maybe this manager was like, I'm going to make some deals, but I'm just going to cut out the profit, the interest that was already embedded in these deals. Whatever that is, he is now making friends and relationship with what Dorothy Day calls the love economy. When people are living impoverished, who are no longer working just within themselves, but are in deep relationship with others, there's much more sharing that's happening. Did you know that? When people are living where they are dependent upon other people, not the individual, but living in community, there is so much more sharing that happens. It's much more of a village. So he knows that he needs to befriend the village so the village can take care of him and he can be in relationship with the village, because up to this point he has been caught in the middle. Do you see how this is a system? And so oftentimes we read this scripture, and I'm sorry I get passionate about this, and we just demonize the steward. We demonize him and we say, don't be like him, just be good with your money, and we continue to make it just about the individual. But then Jesus, he brings it all the way around and he says, you cannot serve both God and money. What do we do with this? I mean, what do we do with this really complicated parable? But what do we do with this in our own lives? Each one of you are in a system, a family system, in a work system. Perhaps you have retired and think you're like, whew, that's past me, but you still are maybe going to and connected to some sort of system. And in that system, you are called. You're called to be Christ in that place. To have an ethic of love and compassion and care, not just for the individual, but for the whole. And that shapes our whole lives. Sarah Augustine, who wrote the book, The Land is Not Empty, that we read this summer, we're actually going to slowly read through it again because it is that good. There's a whole group of people that want to work on this, but she has in one of her chapters where she says, we need kin. She says this, that we need to stop sending missionaries off to developing countries, but instead we need to be sending missionaries off to the U.S. Treasury and to the UN and to oil companies and to businesses, and that's where we need to be sending. We need to send people out for 30 years, and they need to know the language. They need to know how to bring Christ in this place so that the systems can be broken and changed and transformed so that everyone can be restored. I was reading through this, and I was like, drop the mic, Sarah, dang it, that's right. Each one of you are called. You are called in your place of work to be Christ's love and compassion. And sometimes you might feel like you are stuck like the steward. And sometimes you might have an opportunity to help other people like he was. But however it is, we're called to notice the systems, to see the systems. And I keep showing up to these scriptures and say, does this even matter? Last night, it's really funny, but I'm like a crock pot when I do my sermons, and most of the time I come up with, I have nothing to say. So last night, 9 o'clock at night, I've been typing away. My husband loves to go in the jacuzzi every evening. So he was in the jacuzzi. I called him from upstairs, and I'm like, I have nothing. He said, Casey. I said, I have nothing. There's nothing to say. I have no idea. This is awful. Yeah, I do it almost every Saturday night. I'm done. I have nothing. and then he said, well, what have you been thinking about? And I told him, and finally he said, why do we keep showing up when it seems like evil just continues and it perpetuates? And I'm like, well, because we can't help but be captivated by the vision of God. The vision of God where there is room at the table and people who are hungry can eat, and that where love and forgiveness and compassion can be realized and it can transform us and transform systems. And he said, well, there you go. And I was like, well, I'll call you next Saturday night. No, but so why do we show up? Why does this matter? Why do we need to be down in Olympia? Why do we need to be advocating? Because people's lives are at stake. Dilip's life is at stake. And my gosh, whoever the financier who had him get into a $250,000 loan at 12% needs to be called to account. Any bank or financier who would do that to someone who was a first-time just learning English immigrant. But also look at the New York system that would say you have to have a taxi medallion that costs this much money to be able to drive taxi. I mean, you have to kind of look at the whole system. And in some ways you say burn it down, in other ways you say fully restore it and bring it back. But in all of it, it's the ethic of God's love God's care for the collective good. That's what brings us to the table. That's what motivates us and moves us, where we say yes. My friends, your life, your vocation, your call in whatever job you are called to do as a grandparent, as an employee, as a teacher, in insurance, in whatever, a lawyer, your life and your voice matter because you are working in systems where love and compassion are needed. May God give you the voice, the courage, the yes to do all of God's work. Amen.